Does abortion have anything to do really with men? Does it affect men at all? Hi, this is Michael Shevack for Godsearch. I'd like to continue our very unusual discussion of abortion and just do one episode specifically focused more on men. Men are usually not even the subject matter of abortion because it became very much after 1970s with the women's liberation movement, which was necessary and important, and remains necessary and important. Don't listen to people who want to reverse the curse. Listen to them so you can learn the importance of their viewpoint, because I can tell you their viewpoint has some measure of truth in it. But don't listen in terms of strict obedience. The women's movement was very important. It was needed to free men. Now, if you're Bible based, and I'm Bible based, but I'm Bible based my own way, you can see very easily from the story of Adam and Eve that the sudden intrusion of the ability to be able to be material creators under our ego, meaning to create what we wish and not abide by the laws of nature that are subconscious, the presence of God in the garden. That's what I think it means. That ability set us both on a path which was very difficult and in which we had to learn how to master very much the material elements in order to be able to begin to sense and be able to release the spirit, the divine spirit that is in each one of us, male or female or in between, which is made in the image and likeness of God, as the Bible describes it. But what happened is the incredible burden of material struggle is even greater so in the female of the species because they embodied it in the labor. The Bible talks about the women in pain giving childbirth. That's their labor. And their labor was bodily. They risked death every time they had a child. So much so, as we spoke about in the last podcast, there were adaptations that sort of naturally occurred, like polygamy and other ways of adjusting for the fact that the women were so completely consumed by childbirth, even to the point of death, that men had to be used more economically. Their labor of their loss of self through impregnation and childhood is far outweighs the material struggle and the war struggle that men went through. Though our labor should not be discounted, this is an era where there is tremendous amount of male bashing, and it's not fair. So, unfortunately, freeing women from being mandatory pregnant vassals of men and mandatory pregnant vassals of society became a critical issue during the women's liberation movement, a critical issue. But it also did some things which are extremely damaging to the soul of men. And let's just, talk about that. Let's suppose I am a teenager and I go to college and I don't have any money. So I decide to go to a sperm bank. They give me a magazine to play with, and I make a donation, and they give me a couple of bucks to get past, the next week until I can offer again because there are time limits on it. And I have to sign a piece of paper that relinquishes my legal right to my own germ cells, my legal right to my own germ cells. These days, the same insult takes place to women who may be donating eggs. Okay. So I have to sign this piece of paper that eliminates my right to the child, to any child that comes forth from me. But at the same time, is in an unwise, spiritually vacuous abortion law, what happens is uh, a woman has the complete, absolute, unassailable right, regardless of what her other marital contracts are, because it's her body to control the baby because it is her body. And that's certainly a critical component. I'm not saying that it isn't. It is her body. It is no one else's body. But here you have a situation where a woman, and most of the time, if there's a married couple, there's a mutual contract in place, so it's not as dire. But you have a woman who has become impregnated, who decides to get rid of the baby, and her decision, because it is quote unquote her body, outweighs any relationship she has with a man. In other words, she, by virtue of her decision, can break the legal bind he has over his own semen. And by breaking that legal bind over his own semen, she does the complete opposite of what's required when you go into a sperm bank to make a donation. On one situation with men, you must disown legally your right. On the other situation, your right is ignored, it is usurped by another person, and it is dissolved by the other person. One requires some kind of legal device by which you disown it willingly. The other, the danger of imposing the will of another person on what is your privacy and your personal right as a man built into your biology, well, that gets destroyed. Now, it doesn't happen in every instance, but we have to take a look at this. Again, this is the most controversial issue in our contemporary life because every single belief system, every single legal issue combines and distills down into this abortion issue. So here you have two completely legal devices that are opposed to each other. One that says a woman can annihilate my legal rights to my own germ cells because becomes transferred to her body. And the other is I must disown my right before an anonymous woman can take a piece of me and use it for her under her rights. These are at disparity. This is how crazy it is. So then society comes in and says to men, well, are you committed? Are you all in? Are you an absentee father? Are you an actual father? How much are you in? How much are you out? You shouldn't be promiscuous, should be committed. But you look at society and the way it's operating, and it sends two completely different messages. Two completely different messages to men. One is it's an important legal aspect of you. The other is it's not important. You're meaningless and she is more important. You are, in essence, a donor, and she is simply the guardian of your contribution. Now, look at it. This may be somewhat humorous. So take a look at, let's imagine you had a joint venture between two people. Okay, and let's imagine it's a real joint venture where you decide to get together and create a company. And one person, let's say the lady, brings certain fixed assets to the party. Maybe the building itself, the housing, and certain fixed assets like eggs that are nice and fixed. And the other person, the male, brings shall we say, liquid assets. And these liquid assets combine with the fixed assets, and they create a mutual 50% joint venture. Well, does one partner in a mutual 50% joint venture have the unqualified right to dissolve the 50% ownership of a mutual asset, of a mutual product, mutually manufactured product, simply by one person's decision and not by a legally sanctified mutual decision? This is the difficulty of abortion. And this is, of course, the reason why men, as difficult it is, need to understand that that marriage is not just there to benefit women and children. It is there to benefit women and children because there are some physical restraints, especially if there isn't an enormous amount of money to neutralize them. There are some physical restraints that go with motherhood and bearing children that it does not happen to us, does not happen to men. We are freer. I remember when my wife got pregnant, all I did was I had this urge in me that I couldn't even control. I didn't even know where it came from. It was like a rocket to get out in the world and start to move and shake and start to bring home the bacon. And I got to tell you, it was a force to be reckoned with. I was a mere object to that force. It was so powerful. And I know a lot of other guys who went through the exact same thing, where nature moved through their spouse in pregnancy and sent them the corresponding message that as she gets closer to labor, you must begin the process of labor to protect them in a different way. It's a fascinating thing. So here you have an abortion issue, which when the laws are unwise, what happens is you have a degradation of the man. You have a violation of the legal right of a man to his own body. The very, very thing that many women accuse society of and why they require the abortion law is the very reason many times the abortion law undermines that same legal right that men have. And it's a very serious right. Now, there's a spiritual thing that takes place with men that is very different. We tend to spiritually develop and we add a linear component to society. And it's very much patterned by the shape of our genitals. There's a tendency amongst women. I say tendency because there's no fast rule. There is a lot of diversity and a lot of plasticity in nature, as it's supposed to be. And there is a general tendency for women to enclose and envelop, okay, and house, right? It's kind of built into the design of the uterus. At the same time, there's a tendency within men to be linear, right? That's our genitals. It starts in points and it moves in a certain direction. And even our little germ cells have wiggly tails and are propulsive and move in a single direction. It's kind of built into us. So what happens in male spirituality is while this englobing and the unity of all children within that maternal center takes place, and they bring that the organizing factor of unity of nationhood, which you see in the Bible, by the way, in the story of Sarah and Hagar in particular, and in the subsequent chapters with the matriarchs. Even though they're bringing that, there is a tendency within the man to bring intergenerational linearity and continuity of a conscious force of propagation and generational progression and evolution, which we said earlier is really the foundation of what we call, from a religious point of view, history. History, the forward motion and progress and evolution of all peoples and all people and all persons to realize that they are part of a singular continuity and evolution of a single species, a spiritual species called human beings. Men tend to bring that evolutionary linearity to children and families. Indeed, that is the shape of how we're designed down below the waist. That's who we are. That's how our minds work, as many women will fault us for, that we're so lost in our heads and everything has to be so rational, and everything has to be so logical, and everything has to be so left brain. I am guilty, totally guilty. okay, of that kind of linearity. And in this day and age where we're dealing with a more creative economy, which is less, you know, industrial, you see what you're getting, what people are calling ADHD, but it's really men being introduced to the right side of their brain, and their left side of their brains are not properly integrating. That's happening at the exact same time as marriages are breaking up because the neurons of everyone are being organized in a new way, and we don't know how to reconstitute marriages and relationships. This is not a problem. This is part of the evolution of human beings. And as I said way back, is really the direct result, in my mind, of what took place in World War II with the invention of the nuclear bomb. So men are disadvantaged by a abortion concept that doesn't properly include the fact that they too are parents. They too, in a sense, house the women and the children in themselves and take upon themselves the responsibility of labor, you know, that they're willing to sacrifice their bodies in wars when necessary to protect against marauding tribes if necessary, and to fight, feral animals as in the past, which we had to do to provide certain kinds of food. But all of us are suffering because this is not an era where we are primitives, and yet our bodies are wired to be primitives, and our society allows us to escape it. So we kind of have an identity crisis, and we don't know really what to do about it. It is extremely difficult. By the way, please go. I keep saying this every single podcast, but please go to yourgodsearch.com. In the past, 51 podcasts, I've been doing a nonstop lecture of everything that's been in me and housed in me as a human being for decades. And I have to tell you, it feels really good to let it out. But, I want to discuss these things, and I want you to please knock on my door and let's do it, because we are not going to recreate a culture in our country, let alone in the world, until we face some of these more complexities and get past the silliness of male versus female, white versus black, red versus blue. Red versus blue is driving me crazy. Until we get past this dualism that we are all suffering from, where there is where you have excluded middles, there's nothing in between, and there's no value in your adversary's point of view. We have to get past that. So I'm opening up this issue of abortion again after the defeat of Roe versus Wade, because I want this to be discussed in a way that is intelligent and caring and loving and responsible too. A little bit of blue, a little bit of red, a little bit of, you know, I don't know, a little purple, a little white. I mean, whatever the colors are, the most wise decision is the decision that includes humbly the greatest amount of knowledge applied in the way that causes the least hurt, least damage, and facilitates the greatest growth and the greatest good possible. That's what we're aiming for. Now, yes, this is part of your personal God search because you do not live alone. You live with other people, you live in a society. There are organizational structures of society, and either they are designed to facilitate your God search, or they will impede your God search, or worse, repress it and turn it into you being a cog in a machine, a sheep in a field with other sheeps, because you'll be trading your personal spiritual soul for a group cult ego. Politics and religionism tend to do that. I am against those. Not that they don't have value, there's truth and value in it, so I'm not looking to knock them down. I I appreciate the gift of their insights. They're thank you for them. but I am against them as the primary impetus behind how we organize our world right now. I'm against really hard, fast, true, rigid laws. I'm against them. I believe we are in a very precious era, which has to be individually conducted, where we all, as people, weigh in our hearts the correct decisions to make, and we listen to each other and we learn how to change culture on a grassroots level. And then as we do that, the correct organizational principles or structures, commonly called laws, that we agree to can resurface. Indeed, that's how we got laws like thou shalt not murder. It took time for it to arise as a norm, and over time, it became codified as a norm, and we could actually put it on a placard or a stone building and, kind of even worship it. So the men are suffering these days because part of us is no longer needed. We can be replaced by the willpower of a woman to decide to get pregnant without engaging our personality. We can be have our legal right to our body abrogated by another person's will. Are not even needed to supply the kind of muscle and labor that's necessary centuries ago to provide the food and the raiment and the homes that are necessary for our families. We don't need that anymore. And so the creativity that men must learn to garner is our greatest challenge. We are inventing manhood in a way that has never been seen before. And actually, one could say that it's been seen before within certain groups of people that have been very contemplative and very wealthy, with lots of staff and labor to help, such as slaves. This kind of rarefied thinking and gentility on the part of men, where they are more focused on the development of their inner life and the development of their depth of understanding of the way of the world, where we, in our minds, and womb reality. It's a kind of divine uterus that becomes part of the spiritual invention of men, um, where that kind of divine uterus, which is the mind, begins to vault the heavens in order to embrace and compose and distill down an understanding of how the world works so we can lead. And leadership is something that tends to be built in very much a certain kind of leadership, which again points in a certain direction and is kind of very top loaded. And that's who we are, you know. So, so I'm pointing out that again, in this discussion of abortion, which I'm taking two whole episodes to point out, the ignorances that are involved way outweigh the insights, the inspiration, the clarity of thinking that went into the original Roe versus Wade. Right? I think the Roe versus Wade was decided correctly. So I think, it is predominantly a privacy law, and I think given that as the foundation, which I believe it is, I think Roe versus Wade was excellent. But it was a miserable abortion law. And from a spiritual point of view, a complete spiritual point of view, it was really unwise. And I don't believe it serves or could serve long term. And that weakness that was inherent in it led to its downfall. That does not mean the corresponding dig in your heels kind of authoritarian control where governments in a freely elected society are ordering women to choose to die rather than defend their bodies against babies that are sick and endangering their lives. I don't think this is a great act of wisdom. In fact, I have to tell you, it's a degree of belligerent ego. But again, it has its value because the core issue of a woman's relationship to her child and the propagation of the future through history is, as we said in the last podcast, it's a critically important, you know, foundational relationship that's built in society. It is for the woman the same exact thing as the linearity and intergenerational spark that happens through the male uh, is. These are both aspects without which we would not have human history, meaning the evolution of ourselves, to embrace all the diversities of human beings into a single sacred spiritual species from which we can leapfrog off the earth into an entire cosmos that is waiting within the limits of its design to be reshaped by our hands. The cosmic nature of the human being, which we spoke about many episodes ago, has the opportunity to flourish. And by it flourishing, we are all elevated. The abortion issue is such a grievous thing that that it seems to stand in the way of everything that's got us to this point. Many people, because of that, because it is we cannot determine the correct route. No one, including myself, has the capacity to completely adjudicate this properly. No one. That we handle it pragmatically. And that's a good thing. It's a good thing. So pragmatically, what I'd like to do is adjudicate this issue. I have failed over decades to try to come to a clear, particularly clear, positive legal principle by which I can top load governments and order people around. You know, I've tried that. I failed. I could not do it in a way that was real, meaning that held together. Knowing that, I have to admit a certain humility and that this is my recommendation, which I feel I want to give everyone because this is such an incredibly dangerous subject matter. What I would do with this is to handle it negatively, not positively. Handling it negatively is the most positive we can do without being idiotic. One is we need to reduce all those pregnancies that are not pregnancies due to a mutual decision between the father and the mother. This has nothing to do with marriage, but it implies the value for marriage. I'm not recommending marriage between people who are not suited to each other, but there has to be an agreement between the two people who are forming the joint venture on how that they're going to combine their fixed assets and their liquid assets, and they both now have an expanded body for each one. It ceases to be, while pregnant, just the body of the other person. It requires a degree of intimacy and understanding that, again, marriage can be very conducive to if it's not a stupid, spiritually constructed marriage that's only there for power and abuses, you know, either one of the person. Either reduces them to a domestic cow or reduces them to the family mule, which happens to both on both sides of the divide. So the curtailing of any kind of pregnancies that is not a mutual agreement. Two, that includes getting rid of all of the broken hearts and all of the young girls who feel so completely worthless that they need to have a baby to kind of fill their wound and fill the hole in them so that they have something to hold on. You see this in a lot of downtrodden economic uh, segments of society where the baby becomes the vehicle by which the person feels like they own a segment of life. Included in that is the the ability of certain women to kind of trick men to make them pregnant so they can be taken care of by virtue of the pregnancy. It happens all the time. And that, of course, corresponds to an equally egregious disregard for the fact that um, your sex drive as a male needs to have a sense of responsibility. Yes, it should be playful and joyful and spontaneous and all that nice stallion stuff, but it has to have a certain responsibility to realize its power to bind people into structures and families, and that it is bigger than you and bigger than your sensations alone. In that sense, the disregard of women and the disregard of men towards each other in the misuse of sex for power and pleasure is something that needs to be matured. It needs to be matured. The other thing that needs to take place is a proper spiritual awakening in individuals so they become able to have a relationship with their genitals. Um, Spiritually awake, the more spiritually awake a woman is, the more she is aware of when she ovulates and when she doesn't. She has a built-in birth control. This doesn't happen to everyone. It can be taught, but there are many women who are learning this gift as they begin to spiritually awaken. At the same time, men can learn a certain art to semen retention, intermittent semen retention in a way that heightens their creative abilities, heightens their aggressive abilities, and allows them to be more effective men rather than dissipating and wasting themselves sexually, which oftentimes happens to men. And so they never grow up, they stay adolescent boys, brings me to the next thing is that the tendency that has happened to men because of an unkempt and incomplete liberation of the sexes, women and men, and because of incomplete abortion laws. I'm not talking about the privacy aspect of the original Roe versus Wade, which was, I think, luminous and correct, but a true uh, law which engages human beings spiritually. In the absence of that, men have been tending to live with women uh, and be partners with women, but they have a tendency to not commit, to not want to be married, to not have any children, while the women are growing older and they are different than men. They have a cycling in their body that has a limited duration. So men are wasting women's time, and men need to stop wasting women's time, and they need to stop trying to maintain their power over women by acting more like children rather than acting like adult men. The men have been turned into a little bit of Peter Pan by the fact that Wendy's have gotten a little strong. And so that truly has to be changed in the contemporary man, the post 1970s man. All of these things are contributions to the abortion issue, and I find it extremely sad that the abortion issue is so focused on its effect upon women that it has not been talked about in terms of its effect on men and the effect, of course, of men on women, and then the effect of each upon each other. Instead, we've been sidetracking it. It is a freedom. Abortion is a technology. Like all technologies, it We have a learning curve on how to use it properly. But the most important thing on a God search is that these issues on reproduction and these issues on control of reproduction have to be put secondarily to the spiritual ascension of each individual person. Each person needs to put God first, themselves second, because you make the decision. All of creation, all life and creation, future generations, all of these things have to go first before it's simply a matter of making yourself happy and giving yourself pleasure. In this way, the American system needs to be supplemented by the older, more established religious conventions, and the more established religious conventions need to be opened up, and the windows need to be opened up, and a breath of air has to come in a way that doesn't create so much fear that they have to slam the door, bolt the door, put all sorts of locks in it because they're terrified when the established lines of religiousness and the established lines of order get a little wobbly. This fear has to cease and desist. We need a little bit of red, we need a little bit of blue, and we need a lot of inspiration from something way, way bigger than silly political and court manipulative nonsense. We need a true God search when it comes to the most delicate legal matters entirely, such as those which touch the personhood of a man's body and the personhood also, of course, of a woman or a mother's body. We need to mature. That is what our God search is about. So thank you so much. Um, all of this is the consequence of beginning to think of ourselves as having two bodies, one which is a material body that we know when we die and leave it back in the earth, and the other which is a more spiritual, more internal, more reflective, more thought, more light body. Um, Everything we have discussed in the past couple of podcasts is all about that. I hope this little deviation into a taste for the deeper metaphysics that's involved in your God search, which you'll discover as you continue your God search. It's all built into reality, and you'll see it. I hope this little sojourn into discussion of the consequences of having multiple bodies has been worthwhile. So let's continue next time. It's Wednesday at 5:45 a.m. And thank you so much for being there and spending actually time from your life on Godsearch. Go to yourgodsearch.com. Let me hear from you. And please get out there in the world and help us all uncover God, discover God, and help all those who have been lost because of the knowledge that got frayed and people who got dismayed. Help everyone recover a sense of true, magnificent, beautiful, divine goodness and the progressive experience of goodness, which we call the experience called God. God bless. See you next time. Bye bye.